All right, it is noon, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda Pasick. I am the Associate Director of Digital Marketing here at Selby Gardens. And today we have a great presentation for you by Vice President for Regional History, John McCarthy, of the treasures of the historic Spanish Point campus, the Webb Packing House. We will have time for questions a couple of times in this presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And without further ado, we'll give it to John McCarthy.
Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate your help this morning. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation today, where we're going to delve into the history of the Webb Packing House down at the historic Spanish Point campus. And as we get started, I want to thank Jennifer Romanecki, our president and CPO, for inviting me to present a whole series this spring of all the different treasures of the historic Spanish Point campus. Last year, I did a series on the 50th anniversary of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. And if you haven't seen these, please go to the YouTube, go to the Marie Selby Botanical Gardens portion, and then click on videos, and you can watch all these videos that tell you about the downtown campus and how Marie Selby Botanical Gardens came to be now over 50 years ago. And this spring, the last program we did was on the Guptill House and Boatyard. And I really enjoyed presenting that because it shared a lot of great information with people so that they could better understand how important that structure is to the whole region and the history of Florida. And today we're going to talk about the Webb Packing House. And next month, we're going to talk about Mary's Chapel. So let's get started. Today's program is going to be in three sections. First, before we talk about the packing house, we have to talk about what was getting packed. So we're going to talk about the Webb Farm. Then we're going to talk about packing and shipping, and then we're going to explore today's packing house that you can go and visit at the historic Spanish Point campus any day you want. I want to do a special shout out to Marlene O'Neill, one of our archival volunteers, who has assembled some of the information that I'm using today and helped me to gather some very specific things that I wanted to add. And then to Pat Ball, who actually constructed the packing house that we have today. And so Pat was able to shine some light on some questions that I had. So I appreciate Marlene and Pat. And so it all starts with the Webb Farm that got started back in 1867. And this was a result of what's typically called the Homestead Act, more properly titled an act to secure homesteads, to provide settlers on the public domain. This was signed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862 in the midst of the American Civil War. And the idea was to provide an opportunity for people to go out into America and plant gardens and create farms and create homes, and so that people could have prosperity in this era. And so the Webb family, who came from Utica, New York, they had a dairy farm up in Adams, New York. They came to Florida because Eliza Webb, John's wife, had asthma, and the physicians told her if she moved south, she'd feel better. They originally considered Virginia, but then their attention turned to the Manatee River in Florida. And so they came down from New York on a schooner down to Key West. And then they continued on that schooner up to the Manatee River. And when they didn't find the property that they wanted in the Manatee River, they came down to this little point on the map you see here, which is what we now call the historic Spanish Point campus. And they had been told about this place by Spanish fishermen that they had met in Key West. And so when they arrived, they wrote a letter back to New York and they said, "We've arrived at the Spanish Point." Their whole goal was to plant a garden, to create a farm, and to build a house, because part of the Homestead Act said that that's what you had to do. You had to live on the land for 5 years and grow a farm so that you could prove it out, and then the land would become yours. And I thought one of the best ways to explore this early history was in the words of the Webb family themselves. So here's a letter from Eliza Webb from August of 1867. This is right when they moved to the property. I mean, just maybe a month afterwards. And she says, "We've spent a month in clearing and getting ready to have a garden planted. Beans are in blossom and other things coming in, and our sugarcane is 12 feet high." They had obtained cuttings of sugarcane from the Manatee River area and planted them there. And this is a little example of the sugarcane off to the right. But could you imagine them coming down here. They had not grown sugarcane up in New York, but the people here kind of told them how to do it. And when I say the people here, I mean the people on the Manatee River, because there was no one else here. There was the Whitaker family north of downtown Sarasota, and they were the Webb's closest neighbors. And they were 14 miles away from the Webb homestead at the historic Spanish Point area. Here's another great little letter from Eliza, this one from March of 1869. And she talks about the heavy frost of the 25th and the 26th of December that killed the tropical trees. This is the frost of 1868. But she said the oranges in the area were not hurt. Now, they didn't have oranges at that time yet, but they were observing what other people were growing. And by 1868, other people had moved into the communities of what's now Fruitville and Bee Ridge. And so within a couple years, they did have some neighbors. But she talks about now they have 2 acres of sugarcane, and they made a barrel and a half of beautiful syrup. But they didn't go the extra effort to make sugar that year, probably because they could sell that syrup and use that syrup. And they didn't really have enough to go ahead and make sugarcane, crystalline sugar. And so if you look at this photographic image, this is a typical old Florida cane grinder. And you see the gentleman standing there next to the barrels. The barrels is where the juice would go. And you see the piles of cane, and the cane is run through like a mill, which is 2 cylinders, and it squeezes all the juice out of the cane. So you push the cane in. Now you see the horse tied up to this big long log, if you will. And the horse goes around and around and around, and that turns the gears on the top of the grinding parts. And that's what allows the cane to go through, get squoze out, and then all the good juice goes down into the barrels. Now, the first year that John Webb harvested his sugarcane, he did not have a sophisticated sugar mill like this. He did have a horse. And so they made a mill out of pine logs. They used pine logs for their cylinders for squeezing, and they used live oak to make the gears that would turn the cogs. And the story is that John Webb's son had to continually make new cogs because they were constantly breaking. But anyway, they got their cane squeezed, and they made a barrel and a half of beautiful syrup. Now, most people in Florida created 2 products from sugarcane. They create syrup and then a heavier product, molasses. Both were highly valuable and easy to sell. And very few people took it to the extent to create crystalline sugar. That required an additional process, more time, more care, more attention. But Webb did ultimately create crystalline sugar. Now, here's another letter. This one's from John Webb himself in July of 1869. And he says, "My cane looks splendid. Everyone who seizes it pronounces it the best in Florida." I think they were just trying to encourage him, you know. I mean, sugarcane. But it was growing in some nice wet areas with some nice spring water down there at Spanish Point. And he was visualizing as many as 20 barrels. One of the Knight family members from the Nokomis area had told him that they thought he could get 20 barrels. And then that person's father said, "No, I think you're only going to get 16. But at any rate, he's also reporting that the pumpkins that had been planted were a complete failure. That did not work. But they had hundreds of watermelons, some of them 30, 40 pounds. The corn was doing well. They had splendid potatoes. I think these were probably sweet potatoes, although he does not specify that. And then he goes on to talk about the lima beans, how they're eating lima beans every day, and they could eat lima beans every day for a whole year with what they had grown. And he also talks about a modern sugar mill that he could obtain if somebody would loan him $150 from New York. He could get this triple cylinder mill that was made out of iron that was available up on the Manatee River. And we really don't have any evidence that he obtained this, but if he did, then that would have made things a lot easier for him to do his cane. Here's another letter. This one's from Eliza Webb. She talks about we've set out 50 banana trees, plants, I guess, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, watermelons, tomatoes, and then she talks about planting the sugar cane. And then a letter from Emily Graves, who was her sister. Today picked the first ripe bananas, and we've been harvesting rice for a day or two. So you can see this was early on, within the first 2 years of arrival. They've got bananas, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, even though they didn't do so good, watermelons, tomatoes, the lima beans, all that other good stuff going on. Now, we do not have a lot of historic photographs of the farm itself, but we're very thankful to have a few photographs of some of the areas. And so this is the sugar house. This is believed to have been located right off of the sand mound that is basically behind the gazebo or the welcome center when you first come into the campus. And this was made out of material that was created from shell that they got from Siesta Key, and they would form it up, and it was almost like concrete. And so you can see it's like a tabby structure, as it's called, where you have this concretions of shell. And this is what they called the purgery. This is where you would purge the syrup. And this is also where they would boil down to make the crystalline sugar, because that was a more refined process. You needed another kettle to do that. And then, like if you were going to make rum, for instance, you would have a set of 4 or 5 kettles to continually be boiling down and getting the finest product that you could. This was also an opportunity for them to keep their cane syrup very clean as they were boiling it. And then this is a very interesting photograph because I've never seen a sugar kettle with a roof on it before. But this was their primary sugar kettle. This would have been a big iron kettle, probably about 5 feet, 4.5, 5 feet in diameter. It took 10 gallons of juice to make a gallon of syrup in the boiling process. And you really had to watch this because it was as much an art as it was a science. You had to get it boiled up to the right temperature. You couldn't overboil it. You couldn't underboil it. You really had to monitor that and know what you were doing, and a little bit of trial and error for the Webbs. But they had, by this point, other people kind of advising them on how to do it. And as I say, to create crystalline sugar, which Webb ultimately did, he needed another kettle. So just kind of summarizing the Webb farm produce, we had the sugar cane, the bananas. We see reference to cabbage in the letters, tomatoes, turnips, tobacco, rice. They were growing rice, I think, a little bit further east, maybe even around a wetland that would be outside the bounds of the current campus. They were growing corn, the sweet potatoes, the lima beans I mentioned, and then also oranges, lemons, and limes. And what they found over the years was the sugar cane and actually the orange marmalade that John Webb learned to make brought the best profit. So they put a lot of emphasis on that. And then the photographic image that you see here is from about 1885. And this is looking out from the top of what we now call White Cottage, what they called the dormitory, looking out at the old homestead house. And the building on the right started out as their kitchen. And then they added to it with some extra rooms as they were building up the business of the Little Webb's Winter Resort. And then the building on the left was their original homestead house. This was made a lot like the sugar house in that it was made out of that concrete tabby from over on Little Sarasota Key, as they called it at the time, now Siesta Key. And it was at the top of the mound. And then they had another little shack actually down on the shoreline made out of palm fronds. And that was the original house that they built when they first arrived. And I just found reference recently to in a big, what they called a fall gale, what we call a hurricane, they abandoned the house up on top of the mound and they actually went down into the palmetto thatched hut down on the beach because they thought they had a better chance of survival. So I think we should stop just a moment and talk about citrus. And as I was preparing for this program, I realized I could do an entire program about citrus in Florida because it is a fascinating history. In fact, citrus just on planet Earth is a fascinating story because citrus that we eat today is very different than the early citruses. And there were a number of kind of original citruses back in Asia, things like the pomelo and the mandarin and the citron. And over the years, humanity kind of interbred these different citruses. And what we're looking at here is actually a family tree of citrus. And I think it's fascinating. If you look real close, there's actually male and female symbols showing how these plants were bred so that they could get a sweeter product. And so you see how the pomelo and the mandarin combine to form a bitter orange. And that leads over to the development of lemon as it was interbred with the citron. And then you have a rough lemon, which is also a connection between the citron and the mandarin. And then you see the sweet orange develop down there, and you see how the grapefruit split off from the sweet orange when it was bred with the pomelo. And then the mandarin is a combination of the mandarin. The mandarin that we know today is a combination of the original mandarin and the sweet orange. And then the calamundan is a combination of the kumquat and the mandarin. So this is how kind of civilization has taken a fruit that was appealing and made it even more appealing over all these years. And then, of course, in modern times, hybridized left and right into all different varieties of citrus. Now, citrus came to the New World with Christopher Columbus, actually in 1493, and then to Florida with Ponce de Leon in 1513, planted up in the St. Augustine area. And then the first commercial grove where they were actually producing citrus to sell is, the history books say, is 1763 at St. Augustine. I gotta say, I included this postcard of this woman holding this basket of different types of citrus because it says greetings from Florida. And I got to tell you, most people think of Florida, they think of two things. They think of citrus, they think of Disney. And if you want to think about which one they think of first, think about the fact that Disney is actually in Orange County. So I think that orange is one of the most symbolic things about Florida that there is. And yet it's not native to Florida, but has been here a long time. So one of the people that really helped to popularize what the type of sweet oranges that we eat today was a fellow named Captain Douglas Dummett. And Douglas Dummett had grown up in Barbados. That's where he was born. And his family had a plantation there, and they were growing sugar cane. But he came to Florida, and up New Smyrna, he found an old grove that was probably descendant from those old Ponce de Leon oranges, and it had survived the Great Freeze of 1835. And so he took those plants and he started planting more grove from those. And that was really the beginning of the famous Indian River brand of oranges. And if you go online and you type in Indian River brand, you'll see like 100 different of the colorful citrus product labels that are all the Indian River style. But one of the other things that Dummett did, which was fascinating, was he did what he called top budding, which is now known as grafting. And he started hybridizing and well, maybe not hybridizing, that's probably not the right botanical word, but he started taking certain citrus and putting it on a different rootstock so that he could develop what he felt was the best one for that area and would give him the greatest profits. By the way, back in early Florida, if you were sophisticated and you were an entrepreneur, you had a good chance that the community would come to you and ask you to represent them. So he actually served in the Legislative Council of the Territory of Florida before we were a state, representing St. Johns County. And then he served as in the first Florida House of Representatives when Florida became a state, and he served 1 year representing what was called Mosquito County. And I don't think I have to explain to anyone where that county name came from. And that was essentially the area south of St. Johns County along the east coast of Florida, and was later broken up to many other counties. But anyway, so in the graphic on the left is Douglas Dummett and his wife, Leandra. And you see their little shack there. And then on the right is from the era of the 1870s, the grove and doing pruning of the grove. And then down in the lower left-hand corner, it has a little nursery where they're growing new plants. And then on the lower right-hand side, it has a little packing house. A little packing house, not looking very different than the Webb Packing House when you get right down to it. And you see in there where the oranges are all set out to dry, because you have to dry the oranges after you pick them before they're ready to be packed. And then you see a box there too. I should add that the boxes, the orange crate, it has two sides to it. It holds 1 3/5 bushels of oranges. It weighs about 90 pounds. That box was developed by a guy named Bear back about 1875, and that became the standard for citrus for years and years, for decades. And so that's another part of the citrus history in Florida. And this is just kind of a cool image. I like it. You see pine trees in the background, you see cabbage palms on the right, and you see this gentleman picking oranges off his tree. And I found this little item that Eliza Webb had written in one of her letters to her friends and family back in New York. It said, "The orange and lemon trees are beginning to ripen their fruit, and you can have no idea how beautiful they are in the season of the year. The leaves are a bright, glossy green, and the fruit golden yellow." And I'm really surprised that she didn't talk about the fragrance of the orange blossoms, because there is nothing more beautiful to me in Florida than in the springtime when the oranges and other citrus are blooming, and you have that very pungent, just wonderful smell from the oranges. And in fact, something I meant to mention when I was talking about the history of the ancient history of oranges, they moved from Asia, they moved to the Middle East, they moved to Africa, they moved into Greece, and then into Rome. Some of this trade wasn't so much for the fruit to be eaten; it was to make perfume. So again, you can get orange blossom perfume, and that's very romantic. So I call this little section Gleanings from the Grove. Here again, I think it's interesting to look back at the actual, we're so fortunate to have letters that the Webb family sent to their family members back up in New York, that we can go back and actually get this first person account of what was going on. Here in August of 1869, John Webb's putting in the oranges as they are said to be profitable. So they've been growing all these other things, but 2 years after they arrived at what we call the historic Spanish Point campus, they were starting to plant their oranges. And then here in March of 1875, they talk about last year they had one orange off of their grove, one orange. And then this time they have one tree with quite a few number of buds and blossoms, so they're starting to feel better about it. And then in November of 1876, so this is, 9 years after they first arrived, they had 25 trees in an orange grove with fruit on them. And the quote is, it begins to look like we should have some income to pay us for all of our hard work, because they had done all this work for so many years to build up to this point. But look, by 1878, 300 orange trees and 50 lemon and lime trees. And by December of 1881, they had shipped 35,000 oranges to New York. And so now they're starting to make some money. Now, what's interesting is that even though John Webb had a pretty small operation down in Osprey compared to the larger groves that existed in the central part of Florida and along again, the New Smyrna area, St. Augustine, and all that, he was noted in some and a couple of these Florida publications. So I love the cover of this one. And maybe it didn't hurt that his name was the same name as the guy that published this little thing called Florida Historical, Industrial, and Biographical. And this was published in New York and in Jacksonville. And it shows the alligators. Do you see they're they must be drinking some orange wine there on the top part. Down below, you see an alligator sunbathing on a tree. You see the little pine woods. You see some ducks flying away. And then Webb did a little play on his own name and put a spider web up there at the top. So this is the kind of graphics that you see. This is from 1885. And he describes Osprey is situated on Sarasota Bay. It's really Little Sarasota Bay, and has mailed twice each week from Manatee. It was settled by John G. Webb in 1867. The population's about 50. It is a seaport with all of the advantages pertaining. Mr. John G. Webb is the owner of a large orange grove. So again, this was something that was being used to attract many more people, prospective farmers, investors, to come to Florida to make their riches and to enjoy the paradise that was here. I don't know what you think about the sentence where it says it is a seaport with all the advantages pertaining, but that's kind of what we talked about in the program last month, was that Frank Gupta was there. He had a shipyard. He was building large scale schooners. He could do repair on your schooner. They had a deep water channel that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes that led right out into the Gulf. And so it really was a seaport from the standpoint of kind of where Florida was in 1885. And then this is an earlier article that I just recently found, and I was so happy to do so because this is an article in the Florida Agriculturist. This is a publication that came out of DeLand, Florida. And in this article, it talks about how there is a Little Sarasota Farmers Club. And I'm sure that's something that John Webb started up with the neighbors and the other people that were living in the vicinity. And it talks about him delivering a paper and doing a lecture at their meeting, talking about the lemons and where they got the lemons. And I'll spare you all this text to tell you that the lemons that John Webb planted there at Spanish Point were from Pine Island down in Charlotte Harbor, where a fella who lived up on the top of a big shell mound, big Native American shell mound, just like the ones we have at Spanish Point, was growing these lemons that he had gotten from Sicily. And so what's fascinating to me about this is that John Webb goes on to say in his lecture, which is recorded here in the newspaper, that this is also the source of the lemons that were being grown down in what we now call Inglewood. And what's fascinating to me about that is that these are the lemons that Lemon Bay is named for. And they planted huge lemon groves along the shore of what used to be called Kettle Harbor. And then it became known as Lemon Bay. And so John Webb's were those same lemons. And the lemons did very, very well here. And in this article, what John Webb is saying is hey, we don't need to buy oranges from Europe because we can grow oranges here in Florida. So let's grow oranges, but we're missing the boat if we're not growing lemons because we were still importing all the lemons from Europe. And he was saying people need lemons more than they need oranges. So he was trying to encourage everybody to plant lemons. And he basically, in this article, evaluates the three types of lemons that were available and called out these lemons from Pine Island that were also planted down there in Inglewood and that ultimately had come from Sicily. So those were probably ones that had, been started up and brought in by the Roman Empire, again, as part of that whole citrus migration out of China. And then this is a little newsletter that comes from the Hamilton College in New York, where John Webb was, of course, well known. And I want to go ahead and take the time to read this one to you because I think it's a great little synopsis of the situation. This is from 1879, and it says, John Webb, class of 44. He's talking 1844. Formerly a druggist in Utica, is now settled at Manatee, Florida, is one of the most active and highly respected citizens of the Gulf Coast. He's now chairman of the Board of County Commissioners and an excellent one. Beginning miles away from any settlers 12 years ago with a large family and very little money, he has literally hewed out his fortune. A visit to his plantation and a sight of his oranges, lemons, limes, figs, bananas, citrons, guavas, sugarcane, corn, cabbages, onions, vegetables, grapefruit, and other things would convince the most skeptical of the complete success which took brains, pluck, energy, and industry may attain in Sarasota in South Florida. His son, Captain William Webb, is now building a bigger schooner than his present one to accommodate this growing export of vegetables and the coasting trade. So I was so happy to find this because this is just a great little summary. And so the folks up in New York are very proud of their friend John Webb for what he has achieved down here in Florida. Now, let's talk about where was this farm? Because everyone's got to be wondering, where was the farm? Now, they didn't draw a sketch and leave it behind, but here's what I've kind of gleaned from all the research that I've done over the last couple of years. The vegetable farm was basically in the corner when you come in the entrance. So this is the gazebo, the welcome center. The welcome center is right here on the edge of the sugarcane. Okay, so if you can see my mouse here. And then where these homes are now in the Oaks Bayside subdivision, this is where the vegetable gardens were. So this is the coastal hammock area with the dense vegetation of oaks and hickories and red cedars and cabbage palms. And then there was probably a lot of that here too, which was the fertile ground. So the Webb family cleared all that, plowed it up, and this is where they started their garden. Now, around the sand mound, the Native American sand mound that you pass as you walk into the campus, this was all wet. This was all wet area around there. And so this is where we believe the sugarcane and the bananas were grown, in that wet soil. And I've extended it. This is the trail that you walk in, if you can see my mouse going out to the point. And so I think that extended both north and south of there, but we might not ever know for sure. But this was all wet area up in this corner and wet down here. And actually, Webb had cut a ditch down through here and a ditch up here to kind of drain out some of this soil. And then all the descriptions of where the citrus grove is say it was east of where Mary's Chapel is now. And so Mary's Chapel is right about here where the arrow is for decaying into bananas. And so projecting east out here, but they had so much of it, I think it might have gone further south, extending beyond the extent of the current campus, because John Webb had over 140 acres here. His homestead farm included everything that we're seeing here in the photo today, and then some. And then, and by the way, this was approximately 10 acres up here in the vegetables in the green outline. Probably had similar in the citrus down here, and had a couple of acres in the sugar cane and bananas. So I tried to size these proportionate with the acreage. And then I did find one reference to where they had gone out to a wetland, like a little depression marsh out in the pine flatwoods, which they said was ideal for growing rice. So they may have grown the rice out there, or they may have grown rice with the cane and the bananas. But at any rate, hopefully that helps you to get oriented. And then I put this little purple box out here. I know it's a little hard to see on the screen, but this is where the homestead house was. And the little trail that goes from the house to the farm was called the Homestead Road. That's what we sometimes call the high road today. That's the road on the south side of the shell mound that takes you out to the cafe and then out to the sunken garden and pergola. And the Webb Homestead House was just west or just beyond where Bertha Palmer later built the sunken garden and pergola. And then the purple arrow down here is showing where the packing house is, which was proximate to the vegetables, to the cane, and to the citrus. All right, so now let's talk about packing and shipping. So this is the sailboat. It was a 5-ton schooner. It was named the Ruby. This is what they purchased to ship their products to market. They acquired it in 1874. It was not the first boat they owned, but this was the largest boat that they had owned up to this point, and this is what they needed. And when you say a 5-ton schooner, I mean, just to simplify that, basically what it means is you can haul 5 tons worth of product within that schooner. And all trading ships were measured by tonnage because that's how you were taxed. And so if you had a 10-ton schooner, you could carry twice as much and you were taxed twice as much. And that's how that works. So in descriptions of trading schooners, you're always going to hear, is it a 5-ton? Is it a 50-ton? But it gives you an idea. You can see this vessel is probably approximately 30 feet in length, all told. And they can put quite a few watermelons in that. Ultimately, they sold this vessel to the Whitaker family, who had helped them so much when they first got started here on the homestead. And when they were able to build their own schooner from scratch, and that was William Webb, John Webb's son, and Frank Guptill that had done that over where the boatyard is. And that was in 1881 when they built the Vision. Now, I want to tell you what the Webbs, this Spanish fisherman or Spanish trader, as he's sometimes referred to by the Webbs, he really gave them good advice when he told them to find this little point that stuck out into the bay, because not only was there that point sticking out into the bay, but there is a deep water channel that runs all the way out through what used to be called Little Sarasota Pass out into the Gulf. And so that deep water, which is extraordinary for the Little Sarasota Bay area, also ran all the way over here to the shoreline. Now, this is a U.S. coastal chart from 1883, and this was created because people in the area were asking the federal government to dredge a channel up, basically the predecessor of the current intracoastal waterway, so that there could be more commerce. And Congress kept approving it, but then it took a long time to make it happen. It really didn't happen until about 1911. But I think Congress had first approved the dredging of the channel by 1885. The wheels of government turned slowly back then. But this is kind of cool because the map shows the point. and it shows the little shoal that you can see at low tide, and it shows these water depths. And then we do not have a real good photograph of the vision. So I use this fake citrus product label that was created back when the packing house was constructed. And they rendered what they thought the vision should look like. You can see the little packing house there looking mighty cute, if I might say, and creating it like the type of citrus product labels that you might be accustomed to that were created mostly in the 1890s on citrus. But Webb, when he got started, he simply used a metal stencil, and because this is what other people did as well, and you would just ink it or paint it, and all the boxes were labeled, and you can see John G. Webb, Osprey, Florida. He also had what was called a chop. And my volunteer, Marlene, told me about these chops. And basically, a chop was like your signature, it was your brand. And Webb's chop was a W inside a diamond. And frankly, I'm surprised he didn't put that on these crates. But it has the origination point and it has his name on there. And so, one of the most unique things about John Webb in the Sarasota region, in terms of the importance of what he did, was that he had his own sailboats. So he did not have to pay someone to ship his citrus. If he had to pay someone to ship his citrus to market in Key West, Cedar Key, he wouldn't have made hardly any money at all. Instead, he flipped it. He became the shipper, and then he started shipping other people's product as well. We'll talk about that. So where did they sell their stuff? Well, they Cedar Key was a great place to sail to, because at Cedar Key, there was the Florida Railroad that connected over to Fernandina on the upper east coast of Florida. And Fernandina was really the largest port in Florida at the time and had direct steamer ship connection up to New York. And that was the market. And alternative to that, because they kind of got frustrated with that operation because they were a small grower and there was only one train that went back and forth between Cedar Key and Fernandina. And the Webbs felt that their stuff was sitting in a warehouse too long and it was going bad while other people's stuff was being shipped up fresh to New York. So they started going down to Key West, and Key West was a ready market because Key West, believe it or not, we'll talk about this in a minute, was one of the largest cities in Florida, and it became the largest city in Florida, and it had no arable land. You couldn't grow stuff in Key West. It was all coral rock. And yet it's a large city. It's a port of call. Everybody's trying to reprovision. Plus, it had connections up the East Coast, steamer-wise, to New York as well. And sometimes they got adventurous. They went to St. Mark's. They went to Pensacola. They went to Apalachicola. But they felt that it really wasn't worth their while to go that far. And they kind of settled on the market down there in Key West. So this is Cedar Key back in 1885. This would have been a time when Webb was generating enough citrus and enough other products to really go to market. And you can see the railroad line kind of coming down and going out to the docks. So the ships could just unload straight out to the docks where the trade would take place, and then right on to the train, and off it would go to Fernandina. You can see steamers. You can see very large, multiple-masted schooners. Cedar Key was a big deal back in those days. Today, you go up there, it's like a part of old Florida, but it was a big hustling and bustling port at this point in time. And I'm so happy to find this photograph. This is one of the locomotives on that Florida Railroad, which a few years later, they called it the Florida Railway and Navigation Company. And this was engine 46. You can see the number there on the engine. It was made by the Rogers Company. Locomotives are designated with these number codes. And just to decode it for you, the 440 means that there's 4 tracking wheels on the front, and then there's 4 big driving wheels that are given it the locomotion, and then there are no trailing wheels behind the locomotive. So this is kind of a short, business-like engine. You see the engineer who's responsible for basically 2 things: oiling everything so it runs properly and making sure it doesn't generate too much steam and explodes. And then also, you can't really see it on this photo, but down in the right-hand corner, it has a huge cow catcher on it because there was wild cattle all over Florida, and you couldn't stop for a cow on the tracks. And so they had to have a big old cow catcher. And then back leaning up on the tender, that's the fireman or the stoker. And his job is basically to get that engine up to steam and keep feeding it just the right amount of wood so that it'll keep up steam and get it down the tracks. If he fed it too much wood, it would be energy wasted. And then if they ran out of wood before they got to Fernandina, he'd have to go and cut down more trees and to burn. So he had to be real careful about what he did. It was 156 miles. It ran at 17 miles an hour. And if all went well, it took him about 9-10 hours to get up to Fernandina from Cedar Key. By the way, I forgot to mention when I was talking about the schooners that it would take a couple days to get to Cedar Key from Spanish Point, and it would take a couple days to get back if that was the winds were cooperating. If the winds were not cooperating, it would take a lot longer. And once they got into the habit of going to Key West, they went twice a month to Key West. And they could get down there just in 2 or 3 days at the most. Again, winds cooperating. When they went to Key West, they'd usually stay there for a couple days, make sure they sold all they had, and then come on back. So here's Key West. And in 1870, there were 5,000 people living in Key West. It was the number 2 city. The number 1 was Jacksonville. By 1880, though, there's almost 10,000 people living in Key West, and it's the number 1 population city in Florida. And by 1890, they had almost doubled that population in less than, in 10 years. And it was the first city to top 10,000. Now, why go to Key West? Why not just sell at the Manatee River? Well, look at the population of Manatee County. In 1870, when there's 5,000 people in Key West, there's 1,931 people in Manatee, and they could all grow their own citrus and their own vegetables if they wanted to. So the aspect of entrepreneurship meant that you had to get your stuff out to a market. And again, Key West, there were steamers going down there and schooners going all the way up to New York. So usually you could sell everything in Key West that you had. One of the letters, they talk about bringing 12 hogs down there, and they were very disappointed. They didn't sell any hogs the first day. They sold 8 of them the next day, and they were hoping they could sell the other 4 because they did not want to take them back home. But for the most part, they were able to sell everything. And this is in the 1880s. By the middle 1890s, they had a lot more competition because everyone along the East Coast started realizing that they could grow citrus in the lower East Coast. And so all of a sudden, there's a lot more growers wanting to sell in Key West. So the Webbs really were here at just the right time to kind of optimize their efforts. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the process. It's great to grow it, and then you're going to ship it, but what do you do in between? So this photograph is amazing. This has a guy up top. He is running the oranges down an incline sorter, and this is sorting them by size. And then you've got the woman in the middle, and she's wrapping them in tissue paper and packing them in the box as tight and neat as she can. Look how neatly they're packed in the box down in the foreground. They're all packed nice because when this lid comes off in New York in the grocery store, it's ready to eat. It's ready to buy. And then you have the gentleman on the left, and he is nailing on the lid on that box. Here's another image of the packing house indoors, and they've got the same thing going on. You see the slope grader on the left where they're running the citrus down this grader. And then the guys up here are doing a little sorting. They're packing it all neat and tidy in the boxes. And I love this image. This is a packing house down on the Caloosahatchee River, probably made by the Seminole Indians looking at it. And it's about the exact same size as the one at Spanish Point. So that's a cool image from the 1890s down there. And then here's the packing house at historic Spanish Point. This is a photo taken about 1910. This was beyond the heyday of the packing house, but it was still there and the dock was still important. You come up, you go to this dock to go up to Mary's Chapel, come up to the property. There's just a little close-up view. It looks just like it does today. We're going to talk about that in the last section of the program. And then I always like to show this photo. This is Magic at the packing house dock, right where we keep the Magic today. And these are some of the Webb's Winter Resort folks sitting on Magic's roof. And on the far right is John Webb. And he's kind of getting up in years. He's kind of beyond his farming years at this point. He's just taking care of the resort. And then on the left, second from the left, kind of higher up than the others, that's Will Webb, one of John Webb's sons. And he was the one who helped build the Vision. He did all the sailing runs down to Cedar Key and Key West, often with Frank Guptill with him as well. And so these were 2 of the people that were involved in a lot of this stuff. And then this is just another photo of the packing house taken by the same photographer that took the last one. And I like this one because it's got the little dog on the Homestead Trail there on the Homestead Road. And it also shows on the right-hand side, you can see the gumbo limbo trees. You can see the bark of the gumbo limbo trees that, of course, we still have there today. This is probably the last photograph taken of the packing house. This could be as late as the 1920s. This is the Phantom. We talked about this boat in the last program, and this ran all the way through the 1930s. But you can see the packing house there in the background. And then this one I found just the other day. This is a Manatee Record article from 1908, and I love their motto: "The record serves you the whole news of Manatee County while the blossom is yet upon it." And there's this tiny little article here from the county commission meeting, and it says the petition was received asking for voting precinct with voting place at Packing House of John Webb to be known as Osprey number 17. Said petition was granted. So the packing house also played a role in democracy in that it was a polling location in addition to being a packing house. And of course, it was convenient. You had the dock and everything else. So what happened to the original packing house? Well, really by the 1890s, the resort business had eclipsed the farm. All the children were married off and busy doing other things. John Webb was getting older. The markets had changed, as I said earlier, and they ultimately sold the vision to another gentleman that continued to run it up and down the coast to Key West, just like they had. John Webb died in 1908. The land was ultimately sold to Bertha Palmer. The hurricanes of 1921 and 26 probably damaged the packing house, but there's evidence that suggested it was still there in the 1940s when a wildfire went all the way down to the shoreline. And then this photograph that you see on the lower right is actually the original pilings from the packing house, and you're looking out toward White Cottage, is the building that you see in the background there. And here's another image of that. And so this was taken in 1948 when Gordon Palmer, Bertha Palmer's grandson, was on the property. And it shows the old piles. That was all that was left of the original packing house. And so that kind of brings us to a point where we can have a couple of questions, Amanda, if we have any. And then we're going to wrap up and take a look at the packing house that's there today that you can come and see any day.
Hey, so we do have a couple questions. What happened to the farm?
What happened to the farm? Yeah. So the farm, Bertha Palmer turned the vegetable garden into where she was going to build a future house, and she turned it into Duchesne Lawn. And so the portion of Duchesne Lawn that ran north and south, just a little bit east of our road that goes up toward the Butterfly House, she turned that all into what was going to be her estate. She had her rose garden there. She had a flower garden there. She never built her house there, but that was her intention. And then she also filled in all the wet areas pretty much where they had grown the sugar cane and the bananas. And then the citrus grove probably just over time, if you don't take care of a citrus grove, it just deteriorates and goes downhill. It requires watering, it requires fertilizing and care. And so that probably just went downhill. There's been some talk of the 1895 freeze killing all the citrus in Florida. The 1894-1895 freeze killed all the citrus in North Florida, actually made South Florida more lucrative for growing citrus. So there's no evidence that the 1890s freeze kicked back the citrus grove here, but by that time the resort was making a lot more money than the farm, and that's where they were making their income.
Okay. Are there any remaining orange, lemon, or lime trees on the property?
There are some wild oranges and there's a couple wild limes, and every now and then people who are guests come and say, "Hey, what's that up there?" And so whether these are grown from seeds planted by birds in recent time or whether them are just some old stuff that's been kicking around, there are no standing trees that were from the original Webb Grove.
Someone said they saw some small oranges on the path near Guptill House.
Yeah, those are calamundins. I talked about them earlier being a combination of kumquats and I think mandarins on that family tree. So we do get some questions on that. I have eaten some of the oranges from out there and they're mostly sour. I've never found a sweet orange, but oftentimes, or it's possible, I think, for a citrus to revert back to its rootstock. And the common rootstock that was used here to graft sweet orange onto was a sour lemon because it was the hardiest rootstock. And so you'd take the hardy rootstock, put the sweet orange on top, but it doesn't always grow the same when you plant it from a seed. You need to top bud it like that guy Dummett was doing over there in the Indian River. And by the way, John Webb was doing that as well. I neglected to mention that. He was top budding or grafting as well.
Right. Relative to the White Cottage, where was the homestead house?
So the homestead house would have been, if you're at the White Cottage looking out to the west, beyond the Bertha Palmer sunken garden and pergola, the homestead house was up on the highest part of the mound that you can see there. It's all vegetation now. And then by the time you get to Window to the Past, you're just kind of beyond where the homestead house was.
All right,
And
great.
actually, the homestead house was still there when Bertha Palmer built the sunken garden and pergola, and she renamed it Webb's Tavern, and she would entertain guests over there.
I understand rice cannot grow in salt water but needs flooding. Was there freshwater flooding?
Sure. Well, that's why the Webbs identified this little freshwater marsh that's out to the east. Now, that was probably over on the other side of what's now US 41, but those were all freshwater marshes. And all you would have really had to do would be to go around and plow that ground up around the edge of it. And it would seasonally flood and come up and then go back down. And that would have been ideal for them to grow rice. And so I expect that that's ultimately where they grew rice, even if they grew some of their original rice closer to the house near where the bananas and the sugarcane was. So none of this was salt water. And there were a lot of little springs in the site. I mean, I think this is what attracted the Native Americans to the site in the first place. It certainly was a big advantage to the Webbs for the little freshwater springs. So they had, again, a little couple ditches where they could move water around to both drain and flood their fields and farm there.
All right. I think that's it for now. We
All
can
right.
move on.
Well, let's move on then. So let's talk about today's packing house. So when the historic Spanish campus was first developed for the public as a place to educate people about history and nature, they developed a plan. And part of that plan was to reconstruct some of the things that were missing. So here's part of the plan. And you can see it says assume location of the 2 acres of cane and the bananas. It shows a spring here. It shows the site of the perjury or the sugar house. This places it up on top of the sand mound. And then it has location of the sugar mill, which was apparently a little bit beyond the sand mound, not too far from where that Bertha Palmer big urn is located. You see the original Osprey Road to Sarasota here. And then you have the Great Ditch, as John Webb called it. That's still there back in the woods. You never get a chance to see that. And then here you see Mary's Chapel. And then here's the packing house with the dock. And then the wagon road, which went from the packing house up straight up here. They kind of cut down the mound a little bit and they could get through. So vegetables, we think the citrus was out here. If you can see my mouse out here, kind of around where that great ditch is there. And all that has grown back now. And this is from the original founding documents. Later, when citrus trees were added near the sugar house, they built a dock and packing house on the nearby shore, and John Webb learned to cook a saleable marmalade. So this is from Janet Snyder Matthews, who had done all the early research back in the 1970s, had received letters from the family members, had interviewed the grandchildren of John Webb, and had written a book in the 1980s that includes 4 chapters about historic Spanish Point, and that's called Edge of Wilderness, and you can still buy those today. Nice hardbound, beautiful book, lots of Florida history in there. And she was the driving force in really setting this land aside and making sure that it was preserved in the future. When they went to redo the packing house, they hired Archaeological Consultants Incorporated, which is a large archaeological firm here in Sarasota. And this is a little sketch that they drew up showing the area of the original packing house down here toward the bottom. And then they actually did archaeological work to define the route of the wagon trail. And then they showed here where it cut through this little part of the mound. And they thought that it continued straight up here to the vegetable farm up in this area. So this also shows the road that we use today, which they called Conrad Road. That's a name really from the 1930s. Well, maybe 1920s, but at any rate. And then here's the Homestead Road, which is the high road. Conrad Road is now Native Nature Point, and that's the low road that goes out. Both these roads take you, White Cottage would be out here. Marion Almy, who was the principal owner of the company, the archaeological company, and George Lure, who's related to Carlisle Lure, who was, of course, part of the founding of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. They did the archaeological work. And so what they did was they looked at all the piles that remained there, those burned piles that I showed you the photograph of earlier, and they characterized them, and they found that half of the packing house was big round pine piles, and half of it was square pine piles. And it caused them to question if the packing house was built in two sections, like a back section first and then a front section, or if they decided to beef up and put a stronger foundation perhaps underneath half of it, where they would have stacked up all the citrus, or possibly where they might have had some machinery. So I think it was because they had to stack up all the citrus, because you figure if they had 35,000 citrus and they had 90-pound boxes, they would have had those boxes stacked floor to ceiling in there, ready to go out to market. So look at the extreme detail that they went to document each and every remaining pile that was there at the packing house. I mean, this is like historic preservation taken to an extreme. And there are three different sets of plans for the packing house. This one appears to be the initial sketch that was done. And we're showing an elevation here with a double door opening out to the dock, down here. And then these other views showing the door open to the wagon. The one on the lower left is the northern exposure opening up to the wagon trail. And yeah, so very cool to have these in the files. And then this is when they started thinking a little bit more, because they were looking hard at those very few photographs that we have of the packing house, and they discerned a window here on the side next to the big double doors. So this is when you're coming down the wagon road and you're getting ready to come up the ramp to enter from this side. You've got the double doors and then this window and another window on the other side. And this shows the dock here as well. And then this is the final set of plans that were actually used for permitting. And this kind of shows it with the dock and a little stair ramp going up to it. That didn't cut it for Americans with Disabilities Act, so ultimately they put a ramp there. In fact, they originally put a ramp there when they realized that would help more people enjoy the packing house. But you can see all the framing and the details, and here's some more sketches of the framing itself. And so this is 1989 when the permit was sought to rebuild the packing house that had been built over 100 years before that. Now, we don't know exactly what year the packing house was built. I think it was probably built between 1875 and certainly was there by 1881, certainly was there by then. And then this is again showing they actually used round pilings where the original round pilings were, and square pilings where the original square pilings were. And you can still see them today under the packing house. This is the contract for the construction of it. Ball Construction did the work. Daniel Pat Ball, the principal behind this firm, is on our board of trustees at this time. And the dock was built by Tony Brannon, who was an excellent dock builder here in the Sarasota area. And he selected really, really nice pilings. Believe it or not, the pilings that are there today are 35 years old. Those were installed back in 1990. And you can see the total cost of the packing house and the dock and the permitting and getting the power and the water out there and everything else. Excuse me, power. The water, salt water, but the power was a total of $94,500. Well, a junior environmental specialist who just started working at Natural Resources Department in the Coastal Zone Division was handed a file one day and asked to go out and inspect the property, and that was me. And these are my field notes that are included within the county file. And I wrote about how the proposed packing house is located to the south of the Shell Ridge in a wide jurisdictional littoral zone area, heavily vegetated with mangroves and other littoral zone vegetation. The original foundation of the packing house still exists in the form of pine logs emerging from the soil. The proposal is to locate the packing house directly over the original site, offset enough to protect the original pilings. The site was evaluated in the field to determine its impact on littoral zone vegetation. The proposed packing house measures 24 by 24 with the dock proposed at 55 feet by 7.5 feet wide. And that is me at the site in 1989, photograph taken by George Tadgy, the environmental supervisor who issued the permit. And here's the permit that was issued. And when the permit was issued, they had a state permit, they had an Army Corps permit, they had the county permit. It took a long time to get the permits, and they had a big celebration down at Spanish Point. And here's the little sketch showing the packing house and the dock and the wagon road and everything else. And then here are a few photographs of the guys who actually built it. And what we're seeing here, folks, is the floor platform of the packing house, the subfloor, the diagonal subfloor. This was built just like the original one would have been built. By doing those planks diagonally, you make a really strong surface. And on top of that is the pine flooring. And these guys here are building these trusses out of super heavy timber, and they used the flat floor to build the trusses nice and flat, and they stacked them all up. This is Kirk Ball, Randy Muldoon, and Randy's brother here, which is back to us. Those are the guys that actually built the packing house. Here, all the trusses all lined up. You can see that by now they've built the westernmost wall, and you see the mangroves and the bay in the background. And then here they are, very proud. That's they're standing in the window on the south side there. And so if you look out that window, the south window, the next time you go, you can actually look down and see some of those original pilings that I showed you earlier. And then here's the roof going up. You see the nice sawmill, sawn lumber, just like they would have had back in the old days. Here's a great image taken from the east, looking out toward the bay, and it's really coming together at this point. This is December of 1988, bleeding into the beginning of 1990. Here they got the board on batten, boards going on the side. So this is kind of the view that you see coming down the wagon road with the double doors and the window. And before they put the roof on, here's the interior shot with the doors that they handmade, everything out of this old heart pine lumber, just like John Webb's family would have done back in the day. And then this is a photograph that I took on our final inspection of the packing house. That's George Tadgy, my supervisor there over by the wagon. And so this is 1990. This is several months after the packing house was built. You can see the wood has weathered into a nice gray, just like it is today. That mangrove tree still there. And then you see the ramp. These are photographs that I took from the end of the dock. I'm so glad I took these photographs. They're a part of the permanent record in the file at the county. That's how I got them. And here shows the piles that are still there today. And then this is looking out into the bay, kind of that iconic look from the packing house, not too different than it looked just before the hurricanes this year. So that's pretty cool. And then inside, we've got exhibit on the vegetables and the citrus in Florida. So you learn a lot about it. The basket types that were used to harvest the citrus. And then the way that they cleaned the citrus, they bathed it in salt water with a pitcher pump to get all the bacteria off of it, stacked it up on the shelves to dry it out, and then they ran it through the sizer, to grade it. Because if you just put all your citrus in a big bundle, you got paid for small. But if you could sort out the medium and the large, you got more money for those. And then I took this little video. Let's see if it works. Oh, here's how you do it. You put the citrus down here. We saw two of these in those old historic images. The small ones go down first. The medium ones go down in the middle. And if you got a large, it runs all the way down to the end. So kids love to take care of that. They built their own crates. We talked about the label earlier. You can see all this stuff at the packing house. And again, all this information for everybody that comes through to learn about this part of Florida history. And over at the Gupta House in the kitchen, we have the copper kettle that John Webb used to make his crystalline sugar and his orange marmalade. So when you're in the kitchen, check that out. We don't keep it in the packing house because it needs to be more secure. So we keep it in the kitchen over there at the Gupta House. And of course, we sell our own brand, the packing house brand, orange marmalade, photo taken right at the same location that the photo shows on the label. And this is exceptionally good. I tell everyone who buys it, be careful, you will become addicted. You'll have to come back for more. But we sell this. It's sold at the gift shop at the downtown campus, and it's sold at the Welcome Center at Historic Spanish Point campus. It is not the identical recipe to John Webb's. We don't have the identical recipe, but basically orange marmalade is made from the peel of the orange, lemon juice, water, and sugar. So John Webb had everything he needed. And just the last 2 weeks, Leo Caro and I, we've been rebuilding the access way, the ramp back up to the packing house. It was damaged in a hurricane, so the kids that are on the elementary school trips can come up and get into the packing house and learn about this part of Florida history. And all of our guests have access to it again. So I want a big shout out to Leo. I can't believe he and I did this just in a couple of days. Took apart the old one that got damaged, put it all back together using almost all the original materials, but it's better than it used to be. So that's good news. And kind of the final photograph or two here, the Webb Packing House, looking as it did back in the day, an extreme example of historic preservation. And I think it's super important. Most people might come and say, oh, it's a little packing house. How cute it is. It's much more than that. It's really symbolic of agricultural leadership. A guy who comes down here from New York with nothing and makes this little empire down there in Osprey. It's about self-reliance, not just growing your own food, but shipping your own food, packing your own food, and packing stuff for other people. They would go out and get other and ask anybody, hey, do you have anything you want to sell in Key West? And it'll all go through there. So this is like the center of the Chamber of Commerce back in the day. It's 576 square feet of pure old Florida history. And so I welcome everybody to come down and check it out. And I'm over a little bit time wise, but Amanda, if we have one or two questions, I think we can go ahead and try to answer just a couple questions quick. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today and for helping to be a part of what I think is very important part of our community.
All right, we have time for just one question.
Okay.
How many small packing houses like this remain in Florida?
I did a search online. I couldn't find anything else like this. I think that this is really a jewel. I think it's a real unique asset. And I think it's one of the things that makes our campuses so special is that we have things that other people don't have. And I really hope that by watching a program like this and people seeing it up on YouTube, that they're really inspired to come out and check it out because it's super important to our history, tells a lot about Florida, tells a lot about our past, and really helps us to understand how big of a deal growing up vegetables and citrus was to the early economy of Florida. But the fact that people went to the effort to completely reconstruct this in such a precise way and that it has so much educational potential is really what inspired me to create the program. So Amanda, thanks again to you for helping me out today, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And this will be posted on our YouTube channel probably later this afternoon. All right, thank you.